All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been going through a series of video presentations that I'm creating based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm almost down to the bottom of the JavaScript building blocks. In fact, I'm on the last lesson that we'll go through. Remember, I'm not doing the assessments, so introduction to events, which is where we are right now. And again, I've mentioned this to you before, but I'm going to say it again anyway. And that is that JavaScript, like many, many programming languages, is an event-driven programming language. And what I mean by that is that it sits there and it waits for things to happen. If something happens and you've created some code to handle whatever happens, it'll run that code. All right? So they mention here events are actions or occurrences that happen in the system you are programming, which the system tells you about so you can respond to them if you so desire. For example, if the user clicks a button on a web page, you might want to respond by displaying an information box. All right? So in this particular article, they'll discuss some of the important concepts surrounding events and how they work in browsers. Notice, again, this won't be an exhaustive study. It's what you should be able to understand, at least from right now. So again, events are actions or occurrences that happen in the system you are programming. The system produces or fires some kind of an event or some kind of a signal or some kind of a something when an event occurs and provides a mechanism where something can happen. It says, for example here, in an airport, when a runway is cleared for takeoff, the signal is communicated to the pilot, and then the pilot knows that she or he can slowly take off. All right. In the case of the web, as mentioned here, events are fired inside the browser window and tend to be attached to specific items in that window. And when this happens, you can react by doing nothing or doing something. You can do one thing or you can do many things. It says there are very many different types of events that can occur, and they show you a couple of them here. All right. So you can gather this from this and the MDN event reference that there's a lot of events. Okay. Each available event, as mentioned right there, has an event handler. It's the block of code that will generally naturally fire or run when the event fires. As mentioned there, when such a block of code is defined to run in response to event, it says that we are registering or creating an event handler. Now it says event handlers are also known as event listeners, and they're pretty much interchangeable, although strictly speaking they work together. The listener listens for an event to happen, and the handler is the code that's run in response to that happening. Web events are not part of the core JavaScript language. They're defined as part of the application program interface built into the browser. All right, so next they're going to look at what they consider to be at least a simple example. So as mentioned right there, let's look at a simple example of what we mean here. You've already seen events and event handlers used in many of the examples, but they're going to do a recap here. So it says in the following example, we have a single button that when pressed makes the background change to a random color. So the button will be change color. All right. And the function that will run based on that will generate a random number, and then based on that random number, it'll generate a corresponding, really that random number 3 times will give you an RGB combination. So let's do this. There's the JavaScript. So let's bring that in here, and let's remove the JavaScript we had from our last lesson. So there it is, not much. All right, and we will need to create our button, so I can remove this and replace it with this. All right, let's run this and see what happens. So there's our button. Notice that every time I change it, it's changing the background color of the screen to something else. All right. In this code, we store a reference to the button inside of btn, right there. So that btn is referencing that button here. Remember, when you use query selector, it's going to be just find a reference to the first one. There's only one here, so it's not a big thing one way or the other. There's also a query selector all, which will find all references, which would make no sense here. All right. Then, as it says, what's going to happen when we click this is this anonymous function is going to be called. All right. And it's going to generate really 3 random numbers, I guess. So it's going to generate a random number for red, a random number for green, and a random number for blue. And it does this by basically calling this 3 times. And then, so there's going to be a number in here between 0 and 255, between 0 and 255, between 0 and 255, and it'll set the background color to that triplicate or triple, whatever you want to call it, that combination. So in the code, as it says here, we store a reference to the button inside of BTM using the document.querySelector function. We also define a function that returns a random number. The last part of the code is the event handler. The btn points to the button element, which has a number of events that can fire on it, and therefore different event handlers available to it. We are listing for the click event. All right. So again, we can do this one if we want to. All right. Okay. We're doing fine for time. So as mentioned right here, it's not just for web pages. Another thing worth noting here is that events are not unique to JavaScript. Most programming languages have some kind of an event model. Now, some of you who are in this course watching this lecture right now have already taken the AWD 1100 C# programming class. And in there, when we had a button and you click the button, it reacted by running the code that was in the button's click event. Very similar to what we're doing right here. It says, in fact, the event model in JavaScript for web pages differs from the event model for JavaScript as it's used in other environments, for example, in Node.js, which we go over in the AWD 11.1 class. As mentioned right here, the Node.js event model relies on listeners to listen for events in what are called emitters, sometimes emitters, but I call them emitters, to emit events periodically. It says it doesn't sound that different, but the code is quite different, making use of different types of functions. You can also use JavaScript to build cross-browser add-ons. As it says, browser functionality enhancements that are known as web extensions. We're not going to worry about that right now. Okay. All right. So ways of using web events. As mentioned here, there are a number of ways to add event listener code to web pages so it runs when the associated event fires. In this section, they're going to go through some of this. Event handler properties. These are properties that exist to contain event handler code we have seen most frequently during the course. You've already seen this example, so I'm not going to run through that one again. But as it says, the onClick property is the event handler that we're using here. It is essentially a property like any other available on the button. But as mentioned there, it's a special type. When you set it equal to some code, that code automatically runs when the event fires on the button. It says you could also set the handler property to be equal to a name function if we wanted to do that too. So instead of saying this, we could have done it this way and then done this. Now, depending on who you are, how much experience, etc. you have, many people find the way that it's being shown now on the bottom of the screen to be a little easier to comprehend. This has not changed. This has not changed. What has changed is here. Right here, this is an anonymous function that we're setting equal to this. Here, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, when this button is clicked, call this function. You don't put the parens in when you do this because that would physically call it. What we're saying here is when this is clicked, then call it. And then this is the function. All right, that may have sounded a little bit confusing, so let's take a look at what they talk about on here. All right. It says there are many different event handler properties available. Let's experiment. They want us to make a copy of this and then try making some changes to it. Okay. In fact, let's not even make a copy. Let's just work with this one. All right. On focus and on blur. Well, on focus runs when you tab into something. On blur runs when you tab out of something. Oops. So there's on focus. Should work the same way. Might look a little bit different, but it's when we basically get into a routine. Looks pretty much the same though, but it's like I said, it's when it gets the focus. All right. And again, there are a bunch of these events. Another one, instead of on click, we could do it on double click. Now I'll tell you a very quick little story about this. And I've given this story before to my C# class. And that is, it used to be in C#, they had a double click event for buttons, and it seems as though they've removed it over the years. Is that a big thing? Well, what happened was, if someone purposely or accidentally used the double click event instead of a click event, then what would happen is somebody would go and basically they would click on a button, nothing would happen. They'd click on it, they'd click on it, they'd click on it, nothing would happen, nothing would happen, nothing would happen. And eventually, they would purposely or accidentally double click on the button. Usually it was an accident. Now something happens. All right, so notice when I put this in here and I run this program again and I click on the button, so now it's white. Notice when I click, nothing happens. If I click again, nothing happens. If I just keep clicking, eventually I double click. Okay. And as you guess, something happens. You can do the on mouse over, on mouse out also. And there's even more. This is by no means meant to be an exhaustive list. So notice now with this mouse over event, doesn't change, but if I put my mouse over the button, all right, I don't even have to click it. It's just putting my mouse over the button. All right, I like this. Inline event handlers, don't use these. It says you might also see a pattern of code like this. All right, and the reason that really you shouldn't use this is we're putting the call right inside of the HTML itself. All right, and that's considered poor practice. The earliest method of registering event handlers found on the web involved event handler HTML attributes like the one shown above. The attribute is literally the JavaScript code you want to run when the event occurs. And again, that's considered poor programming practice. So in other words, here we've got a button, and when you click it, notice all the code is in there. It'll say press me, and if you click it, it should give an alert. We should actually be able to grab this, copy it to the clipboard. Let's put it above the current button that we have in here. In fact, we won't even do that. We'll just put it up here. All right. And there it is. So I'm going to save this, come up. Notice now we've got a press me button. Not sure what's happening there. Let's look at it. I don't think I closed my button, my ending tag here. In fact, let's put in a couple line breaks here. All right, I think that will fix it. So press me. Notice it's still when I take my mouse. But now when I click on press me, I get that hello, here's my old-fashioned event handler. So you'll still see this in code, but it's considered a poor programming practice to do this. All right, I'm at 18 minutes. So what I am going to do is stop right here. All right, and we will pick it up in the next lecture.